Well, hello, and it's great to have you back at the New Testament journey. Look who's here.
Hi.
That's right, the lovely wife of my good self. Andy and I would probably describe ourselves as bits of nerds for the word.
Ooh, nice.
Have you heard?
I'd not heard, but nerds for the word sounds great.
And do you know what? You are also an expert in this thing, but also I think you bring a real touch to stuff, the understanding of people, which is way beyond anything that I have. And so we've got you in today to help us think through some of this stuff that Paul brings in 2 Corinthians. Mm-hmm. So we're going to hear from your wisdom in a minute.
In a minute, yeah.
But first let's just recap, because we're today looking at the book, what we call 2 Corinthians. And we're going to look at chapters 1 to 6. So let's just remember, why is it called 2? Well, there's been a letter already which we call 1 Corinthians, which we've read. And Paul basically planted a church in this bustling, growing Roman metropolis called Corinth. And it was probably one of the most difficult churches that he planted. It was quite small. He left after a while and things began to go wrong. The guys in the church basically, they loved progress, they loved strength, they loved to be impressive, they wanted to be cool, they wanted to get things done. They were like the Uber church in the area.
I was going to say, it sounds quite modern concerns.
Yeah, and that was very much like Corinth was.
Yeah.
So they really represented some of the key values and philosophies and goals and dreams of their city. And they lived that way. In a way, it's almost surprisingly individualistic what they did, because at Lord's Supper they pushed people out of the way because it's what they wanted. When it came to who to sleep with, it'd be like, you get in my bed because I want you in my bed. I don't really care that you're already married to was it his son or to his mother or something? Anyway, there's lots of things there which are, it was all like progress, advancing. I can do what I want to do. And Paul sends them to 1 Corinthians and he says, come on guys, this isn't right. And the gospel is a much better story than your city's telling you. Live this way. And it seems that things improve for a while. We're not totally clear whether there's another letter that we haven't got between 1 and 2 Corinthians. But it doesn't really matter too much. What we see is, as a dog returns to its vomit, the people of Corinth returned to living the way of the city rather than living the way of Jesus. And that's a really helpful metaphor, isn't it? You see, God puts in even a dog a natural reflex that will get out of itself stuff that's not good for itself. But the dog will not be even as smart as its own body. So he's like, oh, look, that looks attractive. Let me go and once again ingest it. And it's a really it's from the book of Proverbs, and it's a fascinating instance of what we so often, as the people of Jesus, do. We look at something and think, wow, that looks amazing, and God's put a mechanism in us to be like, no, don't take that in. That's not good for you. And you take it in. You begin to look at what, like you stick it out. And a few weeks later, you look back and think, oh, do you know what? Let's go back and do exactly those things we're doing. So
it's not as simplistic as that. There's lots of reasons. Humans are complex, and there's lots of reasons why we do that.
This is why we need you in here.
But it does happen, doesn't it?
So Paul is basically saying, come on, yank the dog's head up from the pool of vomit. Don't lap this up. Instead, come on, live this way. He's like, he doesn't say, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed.
Yeah.
He says, I'm not just disappointed, I'm heartbroken.
Yeah, it's a very strong reaction.
So come on, let's live the way of Jesus. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
So that's the context. This letter is written, Paul, heartbroken, come on, live this way, please.
So it's Paul trying to get the church to live differently than the world.
Totally. Brilliant.
And I find Corinthians so dense, there's so much in it. But one thing he does say in chapter 1 verse 12 seems to sum it up when he says, now this is our boast. Our conscience testifies that we have conducted ourselves in the world, and especially in our relations with you, with integrity and godly sincerity. We have done so relying not on worldly wisdom, but on God's grace.
It's like, you guys are relying on worldly wisdom. Come on, rely on grace. Brilliant.
Yeah. And so where the difference between worldly wisdom and God's grace is really important. And so he goes on and on and on about it, doesn't he, in these chapters. And he says that if we're Christians, if we really understand that God's grace led Jesus to the cross and that Jesus won by doing that, then we won't look to worldly wisdom to win our battles, but we'll continue to look to his grace, which is much more powerful to win our battles.
Yeah, so it's not that we don't want to win anymore, it's just that the method that we use to see victory come is that's why it's wisdom, isn't it?
Yeah.
The goal may remain the same, but the wisdom for how to win is totally different because we now see how Jesus won.
Because it's grace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And he sums it up like this, Tom. In verse 14 he says, "But thanks be to God, who always leads us as captives in Christ's triumphal procession and uses us to spread the aroma of the knowledge of him everywhere. For we are to God the pleasing aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. To the one we are an aroma that brings death, to the other an aroma that brings life. And who is equals to such a task? Unlike so many, we do not peddle the word of God for profit. On the contrary, in Christ we speak before God with sincerity as those sent from God."
So the procession idea is really helpful, isn't it? Imagine yourself on a procession following Jesus. Jesus is triumphant and you're walking behind him. And what Paul's saying is that the parade isn't like, woohoo, like look at ours with all of our, like draw attention to ours, we're victorious, like we beat you. It's not in any way that. Instead,
Just imagining that.
Yeah, but you can imagine that. Is that how we live? That's what Paul's saying to the Corinthians. Like, you're living as if it's like, we're better than you, we're winning, we're and all that kind of look at us. And he's like, the triumphal procession of Jesus is the one to the cross. It's where you walk in service and humility. You're not doing it for your own benefit. You're doing it out of love.
And it's hard.
Very good, indeed. So let's get practical. What does it mean for us, Lesley, to walk that triumphal procession today in Croydon? What would we do?
So I think a good phrase that we talk about is mental health.
Okay.
So having good mental health and poor mental health. And I really wanted to pick out a verse where Paul talks about how they felt mentally and emotionally that really reflects how many people may feel today. So we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. So for me, that's like a description of poor mental health. Paul was feeling so down and so low with the circumstances that were going on that they, almost like we just wanted to die. It was so bad. And yet, so he's not negating life is hard. We're in these situations, not pretending he doesn't have a hard situation. So I think for some of us, if we're finding life really hard and we're feeling really low, it's about actually acknowledging what we're actually feeling, not pretending, no, I follow Christ, everything's good, I shouldn't feel bad, this isn't right. Paul actually says we despaired of life itself. We despaired. It was awful. And so some of it's naming what we've got and what's going on inside and saying, this is how I feel. But then what do we do with that? How do we do that? So
some people might say that as a Christian, you shouldn't speak negative things.
Yeah.
So what, would you agree with that? Or because this feels quite negative that Paul's speaking out here. So
well, I think there's a difference, isn't there? He's not saying I am a victim. I am going to die. I am these things. He's saying I feel these things. We felt like this. This was my situation. Being in this situation, this hardness, this suffering made me feel like despairing. So he's being real about this and he's not speaking the negative. And actually, it's not just Paul, but the Psalms. All over the Bible, people talk about, my soul is so pained. I feel on the verge of death. I'm walking a dark valley. I'm just overwhelmed with sorrow. Jesus himself, before the cross, I'm overwhelmed with sorrow. But that's not all. It's not just saying that, not just acknowledging it. So it's not necessarily speaking out negative things, because I understand that and what that means to people. But it is acknowledging, even as a Christian, even Jesus did it, my soul is pained unto death. But what context is he doing that in? what context is Paul doing this? Is it just that this was really bad suffering, it's so hard, I feel really down? But actually they're doing it in the presence of God. It involves prayer, it involves community, and it involves giving and receiving from God. So another verse that Paul talks about, in chapter 1 verse 3, he talks about God, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles. So how does God comfort you? Is it just that you talk, life is so hard, I'm just feeling so low, that is just what it is? But I suggest that he would be praying and talking to God. So when you are having poor mental health and low mental health, it's that we can just say, oh, just bring it to God, which is a platitude, bring it to God is very simple. It's complex, but actually bringing it to God means actually coming into his presence and telling him how you feel and letting him comfort you. How can you receive comfort from the God of all comfort if you don't let him give it to you? There's like a give and take thing. I would suggest spending time with him. Prayer then becomes something where I am telling him my emotions and my feelings and my life situation, as Paul does, and then you receive. So you spend time listening to him, allowing him to receive, allowing him to pour out his comfort into you, and it becomes a two-way thing. And I think later he also talks about something else that's really important if you are feeling low mental health, poor mental health, is the isolation thing. So Paul is, by the very nature, he's not isolating himself. I think isolation is often seen as an enemy of good mental health. So our tendency as humans is I'm feeling these emotions and I'm feeling all these awful things, and I really want to withdraw and be on my own and be in a place of strength, for then I can come back to God or come back to others in strength. But actually, isolation can increase that. And so coming out of that into community and connection, both with God and with others, because we receive comfort from the God of all comfort. But Paul talks about it in some of the other chapters of the Corinthians, praying for him when he was in this situation. I feel on the close to death, I was praying with people, I was with others. He pushed himself into connection with them, because in that way we are connecting with God and we're also connecting with others. And what that again involves is the give and take of, I am feeling like this, this is going on in my life, but you also ask them what's going on in your life, and you care for and talk to each other. Now I know that's quite difficult for some personalities and for some conditions that people have, and I think it's particularly difficult for men, but pushing through those hard things is what brings about the breakthrough.
Well, I think something that I was going to ask you was, so Paul seems to say, I don't want you, Corinthians, to be uninformed.
Yeah.
So something that I've found, that sometimes if I feel like I'm in a low place, I don't want to burden somebody else with it. And actually I feel like I'm being actually loving by not telling people.
Yeah.
Especially in this situation where it's the Corinthians who've probably made Paul feel so bad. So it's almost like, why does he not want them to be uninformed? Why is he so keen for them to know that he's been almost suicidal?
But I think it's the connection thing. He says you need to know. I don't need to be uninformed, because they need to understand that suffering is real. Part of the human experience is suffering. And he actually says it in 3 verse 7, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. And he said he's put the Spirit in our hearts as a deposit of things to come. So I think he's sharing his sufferings with them so that they understand this world, there is going to be suffering. And what the Lord wants of us is to come to him to receive comfort, but to comfort each other and care for each other. He's put us in communities, which we now call churches, to do this together. And we have to know, he's teaching them, we have to know there is a time coming when Jesus will make all things new. Some of the pain and some of the suffering will only be alleviated when Jesus returns. We can't forget, he tells them again and again in these chapters, can't forget, this is the Spirit's on us, the Spirit's here to help us and to comfort us and relieve some of this pain, but there's going to be suffering for followers of the way until Jesus returns. So let's do it together. So rather than burdening the other person with my issues, we're actually sharing it so that we can actually go the distance and last ourselves. And he also says to them, I'm sharing this for you so that you can pray. He says, people, when I shared it at the time, people were praying, and let's pray together now and ask the Lord to change things and to help us and to move in our hearts and shift what needs to be shifted. Now, I'm not saying it, sometimes as Christians we've heard lots of things, just pray about it, just bring it to the Lord. So I'm not saying that those simplistic things, it's not simplistic, it's complex, but the simplistic teaching of it is we have to try and connect with God. In that connection, two-way connection, the prayer becomes talking and listening and connecting with others, two-way, giving and receiving. Otherwise it's unbalanced and it doesn't work. And I think those two things together is what helps in times of mental health crisis.
And would it be fair to say that sometimes when we are in a state of poor mental health, we think there's something wrong with us, like we must be wrong because we feel like this, and that can add extra sense of guilt. From what you're saying, it actually feels like it's not necessarily there's something wrong with you when you feel poor mental health. It might be that that's the appropriate response to the fact that we only have the first fruits, but not the fullness, or the deposit, but not all of it. Is that right? So what? So if
but also sometimes the things that so anxiety, it's not necessarily wrong. It's an appropriate, like you say, it's an appropriate response to a situation. So Paul, the church has it feels like it's all going wrong. So he's going to feel anxiety. It's an appropriate response, but for it to then control his life and to control his thoughts and his behaviours and his body, his physiology, so that he feels like he wants to die, that's not appropriate. So, Catherine, what's the name of the Princess Catherine?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
There's a woman who talks about Mental Health Foundation, and she's got the same name as. Anyway, I've heard experts talk on this, and what they say.
I'll think in a minute. I know
Catherine.
you mean. Not Windsor.
No.
Not Kate Windsor. Middleton.
Kate Middleton. Okay, I'm very sorry. Right, I'll start again. There's a mental health practitioner called Kate Middleton.
Yes.
And she talks about anxiety as being like
unforgettable woman.
Unforgettable, as being like a fire alarm. So if a smoke detector. So anxiety goes off when there's an emergency situation, when there's a smoke detector, and you have a physiological response, and then you act on it. But if the fire alarm is going off every day, all the time, who can cope with that? Like, it's got out of control and it starts to control you, and then you have issues where you probably do feel like you want to die or you want to give up. So I think what Paul is saying is be aware, be honest about these things, that anxiety is an appropriate response to suffering in the world. There is suffering for the followers of Jesus. We've got to know that is, and we acknowledge that we feel this way. We feel sorrow when people die. We feel angry when there's injustice. But if those things go off and off and off all the time, that's when it becomes an issue and a spiral. And I would suggest giving and listening in prayer to Jesus, coming to God like that, and with other people is what breaks that. Have you got time for a quick personal example?
Yeah.
So in lockdown, it was a very stressful, anxiety-inducing situation when we were living in our houses on our own during COVID. I had a few days where I had a really, what I'd say, really poor mental health. I started thinking really negative thoughts like, nobody really likes you. You don't really have any friends. Tom doesn't even like you. Your kids don't like you. You're a bad mum. You're a bad wife. Give up being a pastor because what's the point? You're not having any effect. And I didn't say anything. I don't think if you even knew that I was feeling that. I didn't say anything, and I could feel it spiraling. At night time, I was just thinking these things over and over, feeling really down, really, really low. And eventually, and I hadn't said anything to God, so I hadn't come to God with it, and or received comfort from Him. And eventually, I got so low, I thought, why have I not spoken to God? And I cried out to Him, and I said, all this stuff's too overwhelming. I can't cope. Like, this is really awful. Life's so bad. Everything's terrible. And He said to me very clearly, I want you to tell someone. I want you to tell someone. And that's the connection part. And so I told, our small groups were online and called pods at that point. I messaged my pod. I messaged a few friends who I knew. Please pray for me. This is what I'm feeling. This is what happened. So that was the honesty bit and the acknowledging it. As soon as I did that, it broke. The thought patterns and the repeating patterns broke, and I was able to receive God's comfort. I was able to receive directly from him. Those feelings that I was feeling were disconnecting me from him, and it kind of, it just, all I can describe, it just broke. But equally, I started receiving messages of encouragement and love from those people that I told, and so I connected with them, and then they could keep asking me on several days, how are you doing? And then not only that, because God is so kind, people started turning up at the door. It was lockdown, so we weren't allowed to come in, and people who I hadn't told started sending me cards and bringing gifts around to the house, saying exactly the thing, countering exactly the things that I'd been thinking. I've seen, I just want to say, I thought, God's just told me to tell you that I think you're a really good parent, an okay parent. God's just told me to tell you that you're a really good friend of mine and I really appreciate you. And I thought it was a real kindness of the Lord. I'd done what he'd said, I'd broken, and connection came in so many ways at a time when connection was really, really difficult. I'm so grateful to him for that. And I think I've learned from that. When I recognise that I start to go around in that negative thinking, I want to immediately tell somebody and immediately come to him. It may not happen. It may, spiral a little bit more, but that's what I want to learn from that experience. And I think that's what Paul does, what he's expressing in this very meaty letter, amongst many other things. That kind of action and that kind of connection is what he's expressing for how he countering those deep emotions that he's feeling.
So good. So helpful. Paul says, what you're saying is what he says in the end of that same verse that you quoted.
Yeah.
This happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. And maybe
he raises the dead. Like he has power. As resurrection is life. He can come in and move things and change things that seem like death.
And I just was thinking about some of this when you're talking about prayer, bringing it to God. And for some of us, we might find we don't really know what to say when we're in a low point. We feel God's distant anyway.
Yeah.
And just thinking some of the Psalms can be just so incredibly helpful. So this is just the very beginning of Psalm 88. Lord, you are the God who saves me. Day and night I cry out to you. May my prayer come before you. Turn your ear to my cry. That's just to start with. That's a great prayer for somebody who feels distant from God.
Yeah.
Would you please hear this?
Just use those words over and over. You don't even have to add your own words.
And then he says this, I'm overwhelmed with troubles. My life draws near to death, which I think is what Paul's kind of quoting.
Paul quotes, and Jesus pretty much
counted
says
among
as well.
those who go down to the pit. I'm like one without strength. I'm set apart with the dead, like the slain who die in the grave. And he goes on and on. And in the end, some of the Psalms end with a sense of meeting with God and some redemption, but some of the Psalms end and you're just left with that's how he felt. And so if you're looking for assistance or kind of a guide rail to pray in those moments, the Psalms are brilliant. Okay, that was incredibly helpful.
What else in 2 Corinthians, Tom?
We're just doing the first 6 chapters, which we could talk about 20 different points.
So much in it, I know. What should we discuss?
I think something that is really important for Paul to stress to the Corinthians is this is not all there is.
Yeah.
And by this, when he points at this, he kind of points at the visible reality and he points at this moment in time. And I don't want to be anachronistic, so let's just sort of be really clear. This isn't necessarily the philosophy that Paul was speaking to directly, but a very similar idea is sort of the live your best life now. Now is what really counts. Don't think about the future. Don't think about the past. Live now. Now there's strength in that. But if you go, as with everything, you go too far with that, what you lose is the story of the kingdom.
Yeah.
You lose the fact that Jesus lived a life on the road to the cross, and on the road to the cross, he did not live for that now. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he deliberately rejected the idea that that moment counted. It counted only in the big story. It wasn't like I need to maximise my psychological happiness in this moment.
Yeah.
It's this moment counts in the big story of God. I'm playing a part here that is essential. It's painful, it's psychologically traumatic, but this is essential for the story that God's writing, where I will die and then I'll be raised. And so for some of us, Paul's really saying, look, do you not realise that you have moments in your life right now where there's psychological challenge and there's actually a sense that you have to put off what you want now, knowing that this story will bring it to you in the future. So, sport's based on this, isn't it? Music's based on this. We've talked about this a lot in the New Testament journey. Why do you play your scales? It's boring. I hate it. Why do you do it? I don't want to practice. Why do you do it? Because it will come good. It builds into something. And so that's what Paul's saying. Look, understand this. This moment is not all there is, Corinthians. It's not all about you getting fame and glory and everything right now. That's not the measure of your life. And the second thing is that a philosophy that we call now materialism, which isn't just being obsessed with money, but it's to say that only the stuff I can touch and see, the word of see, what is seen, is all there is. And Paul's saying actually the most important things are unseen. And by that we don't mean like, oh, love's unseen, or happiness is unseen. The most important things, there's actual real spiritual things in this creation which are real. The most profound unseen real thing in creation is God himself. He is everywhere. He's, in Paul's language, smelling. Paul is the aroma. Of Christ. He's a smell. So God is present, smelling you right now. You can't. He's unseen.
It's a quote I want to write down.
He's unseen, but he is so real.
Yeah.
God is present, and Paul says, in the sight of Christ, I do this. So God is present, watching you right now. He's watching you and smelling you, and it says he's.
Sounds slightly strange, but yeah.
God comforting.
Yeah.
God is present, speaking through. So there's this huge unseen reality which we're trained by our culture and actually by our sin to not recognise. And so the gospel that Paul preaches to the church is: will you live not for what is seen, that is temporary, but for what is unseen, which is eternal? And that's the thing, like the unseen reality that God himself and Jesus, Paul, I mean, for Paul, it's so real that Jesus is sat in the heavenly realms, interceding, praying, calling things into being, directing his people. Here's the thing to get done today, guys. Like, let's do this. Like, Jesus is so real, but he's unseen. And to be honest, I think one of the most significant things, when I meet Christians and go to churches and things, you can almost just tell somebody thinks God is in this room, or somebody thinks they're going through some motions to have a nice time together as Christians. We're like a club, or we're like, I'm doing this thing which I think is religious and I hope that God's somewhere. And you can see it and you can feel it. Or the people who actually think they're actually acting like God's here. And he's going to respond to them. I guess it comes back to what you're saying about praying. When you're praying to God, you can tell some people when they pray actually think God is responding to them out of his own intention and will. He's a real being who has desires and intentions and initiative, and God is here in this room right now acting. Will we wake up to that? And that's really what he says to the Corinthians. Like, will you do that? Will you recognise that the most important being is unseen? He is God himself, and he's here. So live like he's here.